What came first, the chicken or the egg? Does God exist? And why is Eric Cartman so goddamn fat? All of these are questions that have been asked for centuries. But there is another question. A question only asked by the biggest nerds walking this earth. What is the best game engine? Some people say Unity, some say Unreal Engine, and some people just want to be different, so they choose Game Maker. Just one problem. I don't know how to use any of them. I don't know anything about game design or coding in general. So, in my quest to learn how to be a nerd who spends all day making goofy games, I am going to be making a South Park game in 3 different game development softwares, starting with perhaps the most iconic, Scratch. Scratch was created by MIT as an educational tool, but some people have really championed the rudimentary system. For this game, I want to make a boss fight between Cartman and Kyle, where the player controls Eric and has to dodge little Kenny heads that Kyle shoots at them. The coding in Scratch is so simple, as it just gives you pre-coded blocks, and it is more about the concept than actually knowing how to speak a demented binary language. I went into Blender and rendered some character models for both the player and Kyle, and now I can work out how to make them move. I used variables to set the game to either be playing or not, and then I could use if or statements, which constantly check if I am pressing W, A, S or D. If it detects I'm pressing one of them, it changes my XY coordinates accordingly. Cool, just like the parents of Alana Thompson, I can now control a fat little 10-year-old. But right now there is nothing to kill the player, and that's boring. So I need to code a system for Kyle to follow me around and shoot Kenny heads to damage the player. I could use this block to make him change direction every few seconds to follow the player. And I also took the time to create a condition that states the game is over if Cartman or Kyle's health reaches a value of less than 0.1. Basically, just a way to end the game when you inevitably lose because you're bad at playing games. Hey, have you considered subscribing? I'm trying to get to 50,000 by the end of the year, and with your help we can do it. My most popular series is South Park for Kids, and when we get to 50k, I have something special planned for the next episode. Now, let's get on with making these goofy games. I made some quick health bars using the built-in assets. Then I set these Kenny heads to spawn from Kyle and chase the player around. They have a condition to check whether they are touching Cartman, and when it is true, they deal damage. But right now, it is looking a bit boring. There is just a plain background. I went into Pixel Art Maker and drew some mountains that look similar to the ones from the show, but I didn't feel like the pixelated look matched the rest of the assets. So I used Scratch's inbuilt sprite creation system to redraw them. It took me a while to realize why they still look like crap, but I realized that they have to be set to vector and not bitmap, otherwise upscaling leads to a lack of resolution. I now have a main character, an enemy, and a way to die, but there isn't any way for the player to kill Kyle. I went back and forth on a few different design options, but settled for a censored black box, because, you know, it's South Park, and they tend to do a lot of questionable things, which leads to a lot of censorship. The sprite is spawned whenever the spacebar is pressed, and goes to wherever the player's mouse cursor is. It plays an oof sound when it hits Kyle, which I think is a nice extra touch. I could end it here and call the game finished, but I wanted to add a few final details. I drew both a jetpack and a heart to spawn in at random, and they can be collected by pressing Q while jumping on them. The heart gives some extra health, and the jetpack allows you to jump higher. And now, all that is left to do is play it. I am quite embarrassed to say that it took me quite a few tries to beat my own game, but I managed to get there in the end. I give making games in Scratch a solid 6 out of 10. It was nice and simple, but for other things it could be quite limiting. Now I know what you're thinking, but that's a game for 9-year-olds. Yeah, I was thinking that as well. But it turns out that Roblox has a pretty comprehensive system for making games without knowing any code. They also have an animation system, so if you want me to try that out for a video, leave a threatening comment to scare me into it. The first thing I did was download it and test out one of its most popular games. Get good. Yeah, in response to your question from earlier, this game is definitely only played by 9-year-olds. And me. But I'm only 10, so that's fine. Legal age, definitely 10. Luckily for me, there is a template system so that I barely have to do any of the work. I chose the combat option, and it gave me a simple world with a few weapons already in place. But just because it did some of the work for me, doesn't mean doing the rest was quick. I started by building the base of the South Park Elementary School, but when I decided to playtest it, I discovered that every object is affected by gravity unless it has been anchored down. But with that slight hiccup out of the way, I can keep going with the design. I found there was an inbuilt asset library, so I could just steal some parts from other people. Some were useful, but the rest were just a bit distracting. I finished off the school, adding all of the proper details, then started on the road leading up to it. I found a nice generic yellow school bus which fit perfectly into the scene, as well as these trees and a mountain. There were even pre-coded weapons and test targets that I could drag into the scene to create the gameplay for the game. Before testing it, I need to change my character, because we can't have a default demoing this game. I really wanted to buy some stuff to make myself look like Cartman, but I refused to put my card details into this god-awful game, so everything here was free. We've got Cartman's clothes, a hat with an Aussie flag because I am Australian, and most importantly, a Giga Chad face. Spawning into the game, you have nothing, but walking around there is an assortment of weapons, which you could use to kill the dummies around the school. I really like this futuristic one. I give Roblox a solid, I'm only 9 years old out of 10. Moving on. GDevelop, somewhat like Roblox, opens with a list of different templates that you can easily choose from. I have had some experience coding a South Park platformer before, and it took quite a few days to put together, all things considered. So let's see if I can make this whole game in just 5 hours. The default version has a short level with some magical assets, but we're going to be replacing all of that magic with the most controversial animated show. It's not going to be quite as cute as this. My first goal was to get rid of this boring main character and replace it with Fatboy. Changing the textures was easy, but it took me a while to work out how to make the sizing of the asset correct. I also replaced the coins with these spinning Kenny heads, which were leftover assets from my last platformer. The background isn't looking very South Parky, so I quickly drew some mountains, but for some reason they didn't render properly, and I had to actually go into the code and work out what was happening. I feel like this is a good time to talk about how the coding for the engine actually works. It isn't coding as such, more an instance system that states if something happens, this should also happen. It is simple, but definitely workable. The background now works, and there isn't an annoying black box invading on the side. You can also see here the new platforms, which are a rendition of the bus stop sign. Finally, I needed to change the enemies, and at this point I was 3.5 hours into my 5-hour limit. I opened up Blender and rendered some images of the school to replace these fire monster things, and then did the same with Kyle for the flying enemies. Final details like using the built-in particle system and changing the end gate to be a drawing of Cartman's house, and the final game is finished. This was a completely different video than my usual, so thanks for watching all the way to the end. If you liked this, check out the video on screen now.